The body that disappeared. You know that feeling that you were exposed to something you shouldn't have seen, something the world seems to try to hide. This feeling haunts me since that night. I was at a remote checkpoint in the middle of the desert, one of those temporary posts that we know have no purpose other than to monitor the void. It was just me and another guy, Jim, and a deserted landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. Who has never been there cannot imagine how scary the desert can be at night. Absolute silence, the wind ripping ears, the sky seeming too heavy with that endless dark cloak. It was supposed to be just another night of boredom and wakefulness, but something that night was wrong. It was after midnight when the radio snapped. We received a vague message, just saying that they had detected movement at a certain distance from our point. Movement of civilians, they said, but did not explain anything more. The protocol was to be on the alert, so Jim and I were already on alert, but not too worried. But then, after about 20 minutes, we began to see shapes on the horizon, like shadows walking slowly, in a strange rhythm, almost dragged. I took the binoculars and tried to focus, but all I saw were figures, standing still, looking in our direction. It didn't make sense, and I started feeling a shiver coming up the spine. We spent a long time trying to understand what we were seeing. These people were about 200 meters away, maybe more, and they were still standing there. Jim also tried to look through the binoculars, but after a while he gave up. They're looking at us, but they're not looking at the same time, he muttered, half without understanding. I couldn't see any detail right, but their posture was strange. They did nothing, just stood there. We tried to call the radio for guidance, but it was as if the signal had died. All we heard was that static squeal. We were completely isolated. The minutes passed and nothing changed. Those bodies standing in the desert, towards us, and the silence overwhelming. It was as if the desert itself were holding its breath. I started to wonder if they really were civilians, but at the same time, I knew it would be crazy. They were far away, but you could feel the discomfort, that feeling of something deeply wrong. It began to be unbearable. We had been through tense situations before, but never with this feeling of paralysis, not knowing what to do. I'm not the type that loses control easily, but I confess that I started to sweat cold, as if I was with a sudden fever. The moon illuminated those figures, and you could see that they were dirty, wrinkled clothes and faces, empty, without any expression. It was like looking at shop mannequins with those dark eyes, without a soul. At one point, Jim tried to give a shout, some attempt of communication, but none of them reacted, not even blinked. We still did not know what to do. We just had to wait or act, but how to act? There was no protocol for this, and the radio was still dead. We tried to light a flashlight in their direction, but it didn't seem to attract attention. The light seemed to just touch those silhouettes, as if they were shadows instead of people. It was as if they did not really exist, and this feeling of unreality, of impotence, only increased. After a while, I started to notice that something was not there. There was no dust rising around them, and the wind that blew strong there in the desert did not seem to affect those figures. No movement of clothes, nothing. It was as if they were stuck in another kind of reality, displaced from where we were, immobile in an impossible way. When I realized this, I felt a shiver taking me whole, a feeling of dread that I had never experienced before. I thought about coming down and getting closer, but everything in me was telling me to stay away, not to move an inch toward them. We were like this, me and Jim, standing still, not able to take our eyes off those figures. The night seemed increasingly heavy. as if it was getting darker around us. And then, out of nowhere, one of them started to walk very slowly, with strangely mechanical steps, but without looking at where he was stepping, just staring in our direction. I felt my heart race and saw Jim step back, clearly scared too. But the worst of all is that, after this first movement, they started to walk sideways, still staring at us. As they moved to the sides, I realized it was like they were surrounding us, but without haste, in a rhythm that made no sense. No one in real danger would move that way, with that slowness that only increased the discomfort. I tried to rationalize, thinking that maybe they were lost people, or perhaps even a group with some medical condition, but everything in me rejected this idea. It didn't make sense, and it seemed that every second that passed was becoming clearer that whatever they weren't ordinary civilians. I began to whisper to myself, trying to convince myself that I was exaggerating, but the sense of threat only increased. By this point, Jim and I were practically paralyzed. I think none of us wanted to admit that we were terrified, but you could feel the fear in the way we breathed, faster and shorter. Suddenly, one of the figures who was closest turned slowly and began to walk towards the open desert, as if something had been called by her. The others followed the movement, one by one, without looking back. I thought it would bring me some relief, but the emptiness they left was even worse. I stood still, watching as they disappeared, until only absolute silence remained, as if nothing had happened. We stood there motionless, trying to understand what had just happened. I looked at Jim, and he was pale, eyes wide as if he saw something that he couldn't understand. We tried the radio once again, but still no signal. I wanted to leave there, return to the base, but we knew that it was impossible to leave the post without orders. The feeling that we were alone in the middle of nowhere, without contact and with those strange figures wandering through the night, left me with a weight on my chest that I had never felt. It was as if the desert had become even more empty, and this emptiness seemed to spread through us too. Time began to pass slower after that. It was impossible to ignore the fear we felt, and every movement of the wind or shadow seemed to hide something, some remnant of that bizarre group that surrounded us for hours. I had that feeling that something was still watching us, even though there was no one else around. Me and Jim hardly ever exchanged words after that. It was as if everything had been suspended, and we were both stuck there, waiting for dawn as a promise that with the light, maybe things would make some sense. When it finally dawned, the desert seemed another place, almost quiet, but what had happened that morning still hovered in the air. We tried to convince ourselves that, in the light of day, we could see some trace of those civilians, some sign that they were there, but the ground was untouched. Not a footprint, nothing. It was as if the wind had erased any evidence, or as if they had never been there in truth. I started to wonder if we had hallucinated all that, but every time I remembered those empty faces and the way they moved, I knew it was not just in my head. After we got back to the base, we tried to report what we saw, but from the moment we started counting, it was clear that no one believed. They heard, nodded their heads, but I could see that they thought it was some kind of tiredness, maybe the tension of the mission speaking louder. No one returned to the site to investigate, and the defective radio was treated as a common failure. But, until today, whenever I remember that night, I feel that same shiver rising up the spine. After that night, the desert was never the same for me. Every time I was scaled to that point, I kept looking at the horizon, hoping to see those figures again, as if somehow I needed confirmation that it was real. But they never showed up again. A few months later, I was transferred, and the checkpoint was deactivated soon after. Nobody else talked about it, and over time, I also stopped commenting. But the memory remained, like a mark that refuses to disappear. I still think about that night and wonder what exactly we saw. Were they people? Were they something else? I can't explain, and maybe I'll never get it. Only I know that, even today, if I close my eyes, I can still see those silhouettes motionless under the moonlight, looking straight towards us, but at the same time, empty, as if there were no life there. It's something I carry with me, and that makes me question how far we understand what exists around us. Some things, perhaps, are made to remain unanswered. I still remember that patrol as if it happened yesterday. We were in an abandoned village in Eastern Europe, a place that local staff had evacuated some time ago because of the conflicts. It was the kind of place that should not have anyone, but even so, I had a feeling that we were not alone. The village seemed untouched, as if people had left from one hour to another, leaving everything behind. And I'm not talking about furniture or things like that. It was more bizarre than that. There was dry food in the pots, clothes hanging, even toys scattered on the floor of some houses, as if they had all simply disappeared. The goal was to check each house and see if there were still any civilians or, in the worst case, some hidden enemy. It was then that we arrived at a more remote place, a small farmhouse on the edge of the village. The moment I saw the house, I felt a strange shiver. It was as if the air was denser there. The house looked like the others, untouched, but had something that made me uncomfortable. Still, we had to follow protocol, so we went in. Right away, I could see that everything was the way the last person left it. Every detail, every object, was like a frozen photograph. As we walked around the house, something really started to bother me. It was as if there was a presence there, something invisible, but that seemed to observe every step of ours. I'm not the type that is easily impressed, but that feeling of being observed was only getting worse. The house was in absolute silence, without even the sound of the wind, and it seemed that everything we did, every noise of footsteps or creaking of the floor, became louder. After a while, I started to think it was paranoia, but the discomfort didn't go away. We went through the kitchen, then through the living room, and the details were always the same. Dishes on the table, a coat hanging from the coat hanger, a doll lying near the door. It was only when we got to one of the rooms that I felt the business was getting serious. The door was open, and just as I entered, I saw something on the ground that made me stop at the time. In the center of the room, there was a wheel of children's shoes, dozens of them, as if they had been placed there on purpose. And in the middle, several small candles, all extinguished, but with the ends burned, as if they had been used recently. It was one of those moments when the brain takes time to process what the eyes are seeing. I had no reason for that to be there. At that moment, the discomfort became something closer to fear. The scene was too strange, and I stood there, staring at those shoes in a circle, trying to understand what it meant. Who would have done that and why? I felt my neck shudder and began to look around, looking for any sign of someone. But the room was empty, as was the rest of the house. All that remained was that absolute silence, only now it seemed heavy, almost suffocating. I wanted to get out of there, but at the same time I could not take my eyes off that wheel of shoes. It was as if there was something there, invisible, holding us. The guy who was with me also got in shock. He tried to flash his flashlight to see better, but the light only made the environment seem more sinister, projecting shadows of shoes on the walls, creating a play of lights that made the room even stranger. It was a disturbing image, and we couldn't move, as if that place was holding us there. The only thing I thought was that it didn't look like a simple abandoned house. There was something wrong, something we weren't seeing, but it was right there. The feeling of being observed was getting stronger and stronger, almost like an invisible presence that circled us in the room. I tried to get rid of that thought, but it was impossible. The air was so dense that it seemed difficult to breathe, and silence, before only disturbing, now seemed a kind of threat, as if someone could emerge from nowhere. The light of the flashlight trembled a little while my colleague pointed to the walls, and that's when I noticed some marks near the floor, almost invisible. They were like scratches on wood, made by something small and dragged repeatedly. It only made the feeling worse. That place had been a scene of something disturbing. I started to wonder who the children were wearing those shoes, what they had lived there, and why everything was so untouched. It made no sense that those candles were there, burned, as if they had been lit and extinguished recently. As I tried to put this puzzle together in my head, something made me shudder. A low, almost imperceptible sound echoed through the house, as if someone was walking slowly somewhere outside or in one of the other rooms. I looked at my colleague, who had also heard, and saw that he was white, as scared as me. The sound continued for a few seconds, and then disappeared, leaving us in an even heavier silence. At that moment, everything in me screamed to get out of there as soon as possible. I'm not superstitious, but there was something in that house, a presence you felt without seeing, as if you had eyes in every corner, just waiting for us to move. I looked at my colleague and signaled for us to leave, but he seemed frozen, as if he was stuck in that place, staring at the circle of shoes. I even touched his shoulder to see if he was back to normal, and he finally reacted, taking a deep breath, like someone who wakes up from a nightmare. We left that room slowly, trying to keep calm, but each step seemed to take us deeper into a maze of darkness. When we passed the door, I felt that sound again, but now closer, almost like a whisper. It was not to understand what it was, but it was a disturbing sound, as if someone were watching us, evaluating each movement. My heart was racing, and I avoided looking back, afraid of what I might see. With each step we took towards the exit, the sense of urgency only increased. When we finally left the house, the air seemed lighter, but the discomfort was still there, as if something had stuck to us. I looked back and saw the door closing by itself, slowly, without making noise, as if the house wanted to make it clear that we were not welcome there. My colleague and I exchanged a look, but neither of us said anything. We were in shock, unable to process what had happened inside. You could still feel that feeling of being watched, as if the house had eyes. It was all wrong, and the strangest thing is that even outside, the silence continued, without any sign of wind or any sound of nature. We tried to continue the patrol around the village, but the mood was different. Each house looked more sinister, each shadow seemed to hide something. I began to question whether we were really alone in that village, because the feeling of being watched seemed to follow us every step. I tried to concentrate on the mission, but every time I looked at my colleague, I saw that he was with the same expression of restlessness. It was as if we were being followed by something invisible, something that had come out of that house and now was glued to us, hiding in our shadow. When we finished the patrol and returned to the base, we tried to tell what we saw, but everything seemed vague, as if words could not describe the feeling of that place. We talked about the shoes, the burning candles, the feeling of being observed, but no one paid much attention. One of the officers just laughed and said it was our head playing tricks after so long in the field. But I knew that wasn't all. Even today, when I close my eyes, I can see that circle of shoes and feel that weight in the air, as if the house was breathing around us, surrounding us. We never came back to that village, but the memory was marked in me. Sometimes I try to understand what happened, if it was just an abandoned house or if there was something else. I could never find an explanation, but since that day, any place that is abandoned gives me a strange shiver, as if I was keeping a secret. Don't know if it was just echoes of the past or something that was still alive, but whatever it was, left us with the feeling that there are places where we shouldn't go, places that have stories and prefer to be silent. I have never been a believer in ghost stories, but this experience still makes me question what is real and what is not. I worked as a field doctor during a conflict in a well-isolated area, in a makeshift hospital in the middle of nowhere. The conditions there were terrible, and the staff did what they could, but the overload was brutal. That shift started like any other. I was on the second shift of the night, around 2 in the morning, and the place was quieter than usual. Most patients were sedated, resting between makeshift stretchers and hanging curtains to separate spaces. The light was dim, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the odor of dried blood and medicines created a suffocating atmosphere. Around 3, while I was walking through the narrow corridors, I began to notice a strange movement near the ward of the most seriously injured. It was a woman, apparently a nurse, very pale and with a light walk, almost without making noise. I thought it was one of the new nurses, maybe moved from some other field, but something did not fit. She did not look at anyone, nor respond to other nurses who passed. And every time I tried to approach her to ask who it was, she disappeared as if slipping out of my field of vision, always without a sound. The first time she disappeared, I thought it was in my head. But after seeing her at least 3 times that night, I started to get really upset. What scared me the most was the look in her eyes. It was empty, distant, as if she were there, but at the same time somewhere else. Did not interact with anyone, just walked down the corridor and sometimes stopped next to some stretcher, where it was for a while before disappearing again. In one of these times, I was a few meters away and approached slowly, trying to see better. The instant I was almost there, she disappeared behind a curtain. I quickly opened to look, but there was no one. The situation became even more strange when some of the patients began to mention this silent nurse. During the shift, I noticed that they were whispering things about a woman who came to take care of them at night, always very delicate, without saying a word. One of the soldiers, who was quite weakened, asked me, in a tone of frightened voice, who was that ghost nurse. He told me that she had held his hand during the pain, but that when he turned to thank her, she was no longer there. I was shivering, because he described exactly the woman that I had also seen. After hearing the report of that patient, I began to wonder if anyone else on the team had noticed this nurse. I decided to ask the head nurse, but he just looked at me with a confused expression. Said there was no new nurse in that ward, and the whole staff had been on hospital routine for days. The feeling of discomfort increased, but I still tried to convince myself that it was some misunderstanding. I went back to the halls to resume work, but now, every time I looked at the shadows between the curtains and dark corners, I felt as if there was someone there watching me. Later, another patient, visibly shaken, asked to speak with me. He said that he was afraid and needed to get out of that ward. I asked why, and he said that while he was lying down, the same woman had appeared next to him, and made a gesture for him to be quiet. He said that when he opened his eyes completely, he saw that she was staring at him with a look that made him cold. When he tried to call her, she simply disappeared. I was even more disconcerted because somehow these reports matched what I had also witnessed that night. As the night progressed, I could no longer concentrate on anything but the presence of that woman. Every time I walked through the halls, I had the feeling that something would appear around the corner or suddenly appear between the stretchers. The air seemed to get heavier, and I began to notice that the silence seemed almost supernatural. The machines make little noise, and even the footsteps of other nurses seemed muffled, as if the hospital was immersed in a kind of silent mist. I was mentally exhausted, and at the same time felt an urgency to understand who that woman was. Around 4 a.m, I decided to take a last look at the ward before ending my shift. It was then that I saw her again, at the end of the hall, standing watching me. This time, I was determined to face her, so I walked straight towards her. But as I went, it was slowly disappearing, like a shadow dissolving in the penumbra. The very moment I got to the point where she was, I felt a shiver go through my body. It was as if the air was cold just there, in that space, a cold that was not physical, but coming from within, a feeling of emptiness. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. I looked around and saw that everything seemed normal, but that feeling of emptiness remained. When I turned to turn back, I noticed a stain on the floor, right where the nurse had disappeared. I approached and saw that it looked like an old stain of blood, as if it was there for a long time, embedded in the ground. I had never noticed her before, but something told me that she was connected to that figure that haunted me during the night. The hospital had seen a lot, so spots like this were not uncommon, but this looked different. It was a detail that made no sense, but I also could not ignore. When I finally left the hall, I went straight to one of the local nurses, one of the oldest. I asked, somewhat awkwardly, about the history of that ward and mentioned what I had seen. He looked at me with a serious expression and said that many others had already reported the same thing. She said that years ago, during an attack on the hospital, a nurse was killed while taking care of patients. Since then, he said some believed she was still wandering around the place as if she were trapped, caring for the wounded and silently protecting those who suffer. I felt an instant shiver and realized that what I had experienced that night was perhaps something much deeper and more inexplicable than it seemed. After hearing that, I was silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just told me. The idea of a presence there, taking care of patients even after death, left me with a mixture of fear and a kind of strange respect. I returned to the halls with a new look, as if every corner could hide some old secret. But at the same time, the feeling of being observed had changed. It didn't seem threatening anymore, but as something almost protective, as if that nurse was there for a reason, something she couldn't leave behind. Still, the discomfort continued. In the following days, I could not get that image out of my head. On each night shift, I would catch myself looking for her, thinking that I would see her somewhere in the ward. Some patients kept mentioning the silent nurse, saying that she would occasionally appear next to them, hold someone's hand in a painful moment, and then disappear without a trace. It really started to affect me, to the point that I began to doubt whether all this was real or just some kind of collective illusion caused by the tension of work. One night, during a particularly difficult shift, I was exhausted and sat down for a moment to rest. When I closed my eyes, I felt a presence next to me, something so palpable that I didn't need to open my eyes to know she was there. My whole body was cold, but somehow I did not feel fear, only a strange and heavy calm, as if an invisible hand was telling me that everything would be fine. When I finally created the courage to look, there was no one. The corridor was empty, but the air still looked different, almost as if she was still there watching. Since then, I never saw her directly again, but her presence never stopped being there, especially in the quietest nights and the most difficult moments. To this day, whenever I think of that nurse, I keep wondering if she is really stuck in that hospital, taking care of the patients even after everything that happened to her. Perhaps she is still there, a remnant of something that even death could not erase, and so continues to wander, protecting those in need. It is an experience that I carry with me, and that still makes me question what is real and what exists beyond what we can understand. I spent a good part of my career as a Marine in remote places, but none of them impressed me as much as that outpost in an abandoned village in the mountains. The place was already practically in ruins when we arrived, with several houses destroyed and a silence that was only broken by the biting wind of dawn. The whole village seemed frozen in time, as if it was waiting for something that would never arrive. I was used to working in isolated places, but there the environment was different. Even with everything destroyed, it was as if there was still something present, a weight that we could not explain. On the first nights of shift, everything seemed normal. I was doing what I always did, keeping watch and talking a little with the guys who were with me. But after a few mornings, I began to hear a faint, distant music coming from the back of the village, like a whisper carried by the wind. I thought it was something in my head, the effect of sleep deprivation or boredom of the early morning shift. It was a strange melody, something traditional, with a rhythm that I could not identify, but that left in discomfort that seemed to spread throughout the post. The music started to appear more often, always at the same time, around 2 or 3 in the morning. I tried to ignore it, concentrate on work, but it was difficult. The melody seemed to drag through the air, crossing the walls of the post as if it came from all sides, but at the same time it seemed far away. I talked about it with one of the soldiers, and he just laughed, saying that I should be listening to the wind. But one night he heard it too. I was standing next to him when the first chords of that song began to float in the air, and I saw his face change instantly. He tried to pretend that he was not listening to anything, but I could see that he was as disconcerted as me. From that moment on, things got serious. Now it wasn't just me, and it didn't seem like a trick of our mind anymore. At first, we thought that maybe there was someone hiding in the village, some resident or even some deserter, so we decided to investigate. We walked through the deserted streets, attentive to any sign, but it seemed that the music moved, guiding us to a deeper point in the village. With each step we took, the melody seemed sharper, but the discomfort also increased. The village was even darker that night. The destroyed houses and the rubble around us gave the impression that we were walking through a place that should be avoided. The music, however, did not stop. It kept on that hypnotizing rhythm, and at every corner we turned, it seemed to move away, pulling us deeper. At one point, my colleague suggested that we go back, but something in that melody made me want to continue. It was as if there was an explanation waiting for us, and I needed to understand what was going on there. I wanted to believe that I would find someone, maybe a lost resident, but deep down I knew it wasn't so simple. After a few minutes, we stopped in front of an old house, almost hidden by darkness. The melody seemed to come from within her, as if the walls were resonating with the music. The place was falling apart, with the roof partially collapsed and the door half open. We looked at each other, and we both knew that going in there was a bad idea, but we were so close that it was impossible to back out. We entered slowly, with the lanterns in hand, and as soon as we crossed the door, silence took over. The music just stopped. Inside the house, the air was heavy, with a smell of dust and mold that made the environment seem even more suffocating. There was no sign of life, nothing to indicate that anyone was there. The walls were covered with dirt, with pieces of old furniture thrown from the floor. We walked slowly through the rooms, attentive to any sound, but the music had disappeared completely. The feeling of being pulled, almost as if something invisible was guiding us, gave way to a more intense discomfort, a kind of silent warning that told us to leave as soon as possible. It was when we arrived at one of the rooms that something really strange happened. In that room, the floor was empty, but there were marks, as if someone had dragged something heavy into the center of the room. It looked like a kind of faded circle on the ground, something that could have been done years ago. We stood there, trying to understand what that place meant, as the feeling of being watched intensified. I tried to keep the idea that someone or something could be there, but at that time, I knew we were not alone. That complete silence was messing with us. It was as if the sound had been sucked out of the environment, and the weight of that absence of noise made my ears almost hurt. We both stood there, standing, looking at that faded circle on the ground, not sure what to do. The lantern lit up the worn walls, and every time I pointed the beam of light to a different corner, I had the feeling that I would see something moving, but nothing was there. My heart was beating so fast that I could barely breathe properly, as if all the air in the room was getting denser. After a few minutes, a very low noise began to appear, like a whisper, almost imperceptible, and I had to concentrate on listening. Gradually, the sound changed, and I realized that it was the same melody as before, only now even weaker, almost like coming from under the earth. My colleague also heard, and from his expression, I knew he was as disconcerted as me. It was as if the music was spreading on the floor, reverberating on the walls of the house. I wanted to get out of there, but it was as if my feet were stuck, unable to move. As the music continued to echo, increasingly weak but insistent, a cold sensation ran through my spine. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew that it wasn't normal. The sound, once distant and almost inviting, now seemed like a warning, something that told us to get out of there before it was too late. Still, it was as if some kind of sick fascination held us in place. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was approaching, something invisible, and could not ignore the idea that that house kept a memory that did not want to be interrupted. It was then that my colleague, in a sudden movement, turned off the flashlight and pulled me back, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. At the exact moment when the light went out, the music stopped too, leaving a silence even more overwhelming than before. You could feel the fear in his eyes, and for the first time, my survival instinct spoke louder than curiosity. Without looking back, we left the house as fast as we could, crossing the dark ground, with the feeling that something or someone was watching us as we ran away from that place. When we finally got far enough away, we stopped for a moment to catch our breath. None of us said anything, but I knew that what we had just lived would be marked in our minds. The village was silent again, as if nothing had happened, and everything around it seemed to return to normal, except for the feeling that we had crossed an invisible line. On the way back to the post, the path seemed longer, and I could not help looking back at each step, hoping to see some shadow or movement coming out of the house. But it was all quiet, as if the village itself were sleeping again. Later, some locals commented that the house belonged to a family who disappeared during the conflict, and that the music was an echo of their last hours, something some believed to be stuck there, repeating forever. Even so, no one seemed to have a concrete explanation. All I know is that, since that night, I never heard the music again, but the memory of that sound still gives me shivers. I wonder if we really heard something, or if that was a warning, something to remind us that certain memories and certain presences never disappear completely. This is one of those stories I really would prefer to forget, but it keeps coming back to my head from time to time. I was on a mission near a border area known to be full of landmines, and the plan was simple: check for signs of enemy activity in a specific area. The night was pitch dark, and the silence of the place made everything seem even heavier. It was just me and a colleague, and even knowing the risks, we had received clear orders to advance. The tension was present from the beginning, because each step could be the last. As we went through the field, each sound sounded louder than usual. The wind was light, and you could only hear our steps, but after a few minutes, I started to notice something strange. I heard steps behind me, as if someone was following us, but slow, almost dragged. I thought it was something in my head, that maybe it was the echo of our own steps or some animal around. But the steps continued, and every time I stopped to listen better, they also stopped. With each meter we advanced, that feeling of being followed only increased. I was starting to sweat, and it wasn't from the heat or weight of the equipment, but from a fear that I couldn't explain. I talked to my colleague, but he just looked at me in a strange way and said that he wasn't listening to anything. That made me even more tense, because it was like I was hallucinating. But the steps continued there, always at the same pace, keeping a constant distance behind us. I glanced back, but only saw the darkness, no sign of movement or anything that would explain what I was hearing. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something touch my shoulder. It was a light but firm pressure, enough to make my heart race. I turned quickly, pointing the lantern, but there was no one there. Only the emptiness, the shadows of the field, and absolute silence. My colleague asked me what I was doing, and I could only babble that I had felt something. He looked at me as if I was going crazy, and honestly, I was starting to think so too. But before I could say anything, a quick shadow appeared on the edge of my vision, like a figure wearing an old uniform. That vision was too fast, like a flash, but enough to make my stomach freeze. He looked like a soldier in an old uniform, something I recognized from old photos, from the time of past conflicts in that area. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what I had just seen. Was it some kind of illusion? The darkness of night was playing tricks on my head? I tried to convince myself that it was just a shadow or some strange reflection, but the fear was growing, and I couldn't remove the feeling that something was really there watching us. We kept walking, but with each step I took, that presence seemed closer. The steps behind me came back, more intense, as if the thing I saw was now following us closely. I was practically holding my breath, trying to focus only on the way ahead and avoid looking back. Only that deep down I felt that if I looked, I would see that figure again standing watching us. Every time my eyes tried to move in the direction of the shadow, it seemed that the air around us became heavier, as if something invisible was compressing the space around us. The tension was unbearable, and I was almost panicking. My colleague seemed completely oblivious to what I was feeling, walking as if nothing was wrong, while I felt that presence behind me at every step. It was then that a new detail scared me even more. The sound of the steps was no longer in sync with ours. Now it was as if they walked at a different pace, first slower, then faster, almost hurried to catch up with us. I began to whisper to myself that it couldn't be happening, but the fear was already impregnating me. Suddenly, I felt a cold rising up the spine, as if someone had just blown cold air into my neck. I stopped for a second, and the silence that came was suffocating. Everything was quiet, even the sound of footsteps behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, but before I could process what was happening, I heard a low snap, as if someone had stepped on a rock behind me. I looked quickly, but what I saw made me freeze with fear. There, a few meters away, was the figure of a soldier in a uniform from decades ago, looking directly at me with an empty look, as if he was lost in another time. The sight of that standing soldier staring at me made my body freeze. I could not look away, stuck in that figure that seemed to have come straight out of a memory buried in that soil. He did not move, just stood there motionless, with empty eyes, as if he saw me, but at the same time was not really present. I wanted to call my colleague, but it was as if my voice had disappeared. I was frozen by fear, feeling that any sudden movement could break the silence and bring something even worse. Suddenly, in a blink of an eye, he disappeared. It was as if he had never been there. The air around me seemed to get lighter, but the feeling of dread was still with me. As soon as I could walk back, and as we got back to the post, I knew I couldn't say anything. Who would believe? But days later, one of the local guides casually commented on the camp, telling stories of soldiers who would have died there decades ago. He spoke of the strange apparitions and whispers, and hearing that, I realized that I was not the only one who found something that night. Don't know who or what it was, but to this day, I still feel like I left something unfinished in that field. This is one of those memories that I would rather not have, but that sometimes still torments me. I was in a training camp in the middle of a dense, isolated forest, a place where the fog was so thick in the morning that you could barely see the ground. It was the perfect setting for an endurance and observation training, but also caused a strange feeling of isolation. That particular morning, I was in a recognition exercise, walking slowly and paying attention to every sound, every movement. It was all in absolute silence, until I saw a figure in the distance among the trees. I stopped at the time, thinking it was one of my colleagues, but something in that silhouette caught my attention. The figure seemed out of place, as if it was frozen in a moment of another time. I could distinguish what seemed to be an old helmet and a uniform that, although worn, did not look like ours. I was trying to focus better, approaching slowly to see what it was, but as I went forward, the fog became denser, and in a blink of an eye, the figure disappeared completely between the trees. It left me puzzled, and at the same time with an uneasiness that I could not explain. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for the figure to reappear. But nothing, only the heavy silence of the forest and the increasingly thick fog around me. I decided to move on, thinking that I had imagined or that it was some trick of my eyes because of the fog. But even trying to convince myself of this, I kept feeling that shiver in the spine, a sense that there was something there watching me. Further on, as I walked among the trees, I saw the same face again, but this time closer. It was partially covered by the fog, and I could only see the outline of the helmet and part of the uniform. He was still, as if he was watching me too. I took a deep breath, approached slowly, and when I was almost getting close enough to see details, it disappeared again, dissolving in the mist. By this time, my heart was already pounding. I tried to stay rational, but it was impossible to ignore that feeling that something was wrong. It was as if I was being pulled into some kind of strange game, where every time I approached, the figure disappeared, but somehow always appeared again ahead. Continued walking, slower this time, attentive to every detail. The forest seemed to close around me, and the silence became so heavy that I could hear my own breath echoing. It was then that, for the third time, the figure reappeared. Only this time, she was much closer, almost within reach of an arm. I froze at the time, trying to absorb the details. The helmet was really old, like those used in past decades, and the uniform was faded, as if it had been left to time for years. The soldier, or whatever it was on his back to me, but I could feel that he knew I was there. I wanted to call him, touch his shoulder, but something stopped me. It was as if every fiber of my body told me not to come near. At that moment, I stood still, not knowing what to do. Every second there seemed to drag, and my whole body was caught between the urge to move away and the curiosity to understand what it was. When I finally managed to step forward, the figure moved, but in a strange way, almost as if it was sliding. She went a few meters ahead, still with her back, and disappeared among the trees once more. The mist swallowed the silhouette so fast that I wondered if I had really seen it or if my mind was playing tricks. I was so upset that I decided to go back to camp. On the way, he looked back constantly, feeling as if he was being followed, but saw nothing but the fog and shadows of the trees. Every step I took seemed that the silence of the forest became heavier, as if nature itself was holding its breath. When I finally arrived at the camp, I tried to put my thoughts in order, but the feeling of being observed and the cold in my spine. Back at the camp, still restless, I decided to talk to one of the superiors. I explained what I had seen, trying to sound rational, but I knew that my voice was denouncing the nervousness. He listened to everything in silence, without expressing much reaction. When I finished, he just nodded and said something that did not bring me any relief. Commented that I was not the first to report the presence of strange figures in that area, and that other soldiers had seen a silhouette wearing old military equipment. According to him, it was something that happened there from time to time, but no one had an explanation. The information left me in a mixture of relief and discomfort. Knowing that others had seen the same thing meant I wasn't imagining it, but at the same time raised a series of questions. Who was that soldier? Why did he appear there, always disappearing in the fog? That night, I tried to sleep, but the image of that figure, motionless among the trees, did not leave my head. Even after so long, I still remember the details and the strange silence that seemed to envelop the whole forest that morning. In the following days, I tried to avoid the area where I had seen the figure, but every time I was on patrol, that feeling of being observed came back. The forest seemed to carry a presence that only those who were there could understand, as if it kept stories that would never be told. Over time, I heard whispers from other soldiers who had gone through similar experiences, all describing the same type of silhouette, always disappearing before they could approach. It was as if the figure was stuck there, repeating endless movements, without being able to leave that place. Until today, I wonder if it was just an impression or if there really was a presence there, something beyond what we can understand. I don't know if it was someone who was left behind or a memory lost in that field, but the memory of that morning still haunts me. Every time I see a forest covered with fog, I feel the same shiver and remember that silhouette, immobile and unreachable, keeping secrets that may never be revealed. The strange footprints in the mud. During my time in Vietnam, we spent weeks camping in an area of the forest that seemed never to see the sunlight. The canopy was dense, and the humidity mixed with heat created a near constant mist. At the time, I was already used to harsh conditions, but that particular area had something that made everyone uncomfortable. We were an experienced group, and no one spoke out loud, but the atmosphere of tension was visible. At night, the silence was so deep that we heard our own hearts beating, and everything seemed alive in a strange way, as if the forest were watching us. On the third or fourth day, it was when we noticed the footprints. They were in the mud, a few meters from the camp, and their shape was what caught the eye. They looked human, but with long fingers and separated like claws. At first, we thought it might be some animal, but the more we looked at them, the stranger they seemed. There was something disturbing about them, especially the fact that the footprints did not lead anywhere. It was as if they started and ended from nowhere, without a definite path. The footprints began to appear every morning, always in the same places near the camp, but never went anywhere. Every time we found them, it seemed they were sharper, as if someone or something had just passed by. The mood among the group was changing, and even the most skeptical began to be bothered. Some tried to justify it as the footprints of some rare animal from the forest, but no one really believed it. In silence, we knew that it was not something common, and each new trace made us more tense. One night, one of our companions, Daniels, decided to stand guard at the camp perimeter. He was a tough guy, never believed in stories, and always laughed when someone showed any sign of fear. But that night he came back at dawn completely different, with a pale face and wide eyes. When we asked what had happened, he could hardly explain. He only repeated that he saw figures among the trees, but could not describe what exactly they were. The way he talked about it made me shiver. Daniels was the last guy in the group I would imagine getting shaken up by something like that. He seemed really in shock, and the worst part is that none of us knew how to react. Those figures he mentioned, even without explaining exactly what they were, made us even more paranoid. The forest, already a hostile place, began to seem increasingly closed and suffocating. Every sound at night, every movement of the leaf, made everyone alert. After that night, we decided to double up the surveillance and try to monitor the areas where the footprints appeared, even without knowing what we were looking for. But nothing but the footprints appeared. It was as if something was playing with us, leaving traces only to confuse us. A few days later, however, everything changed. Daniels disappeared during the night patrol. We searched for hours, calling his name through the forest, but only found him the next morning, disoriented and with an empty gaze. When we found Daniels, he was sitting on the ground, leaning against a tree, his clothes soaked in sweat and mud. His gaze was far away, as if he were somewhere far away from there. We called him by name a few times until he finally reacted, but seemed not to recognize us immediately. Whatever happened that night had shaken him in a way we never saw. Daniels was not the kind of person who would be easily frightened, but he was unrecognizable. After a while, we got him to say something. He just repeated with a trembling voice that he saw them again, and that they were closer this time. We asked what they were, trying to understand, but he just shook his head, as if the words were not enough to describe what he had seen. In the end, all he could say was that the figures seemed to be waiting, peeking out of the trees, but always out of reach. From that day on, Daniels was not the same. He avoided talking to us, always looked at the forest as if he was waiting for something to come up at any moment. The officers tried to send him back to base, but he insisted on staying with us, despite the obvious state of shock. We were all on constant alert, and the footprints in the mud continued to appear around the camp without any explanation. The most disturbing was that the marks looked increasingly fresh, as if someone had just passed. That last night, the tension was unbearable. No one could sleep properly, and each of us was attentive to any sound or movement. It was then that, during the early morning, we heard a loud clap, as if something had broken a branch right near the camp. We were in absolute silence, waiting to see what would happen. I looked at Daniels, who seemed in trance, fixed in the direction from where the sound came. But before anyone could react, he rose and disappeared into the forest without a word. We went after him as fast as possible, shouting his name while trying to follow the trail he left. The forest was dark, and every step was risky. After a few minutes of searching, we finally found him standing in the middle of a clearing. He was staring at the ground, where there was a new series of footprints, much deeper and even more strange, as if someone or something had just passed by. Daniels turned to us with a lost look, and all he could say was, "They will not stop following." It was then that we realized that we could not do anything more there. We returned to the camp in silence, and in the early hours of the morning, we asked to leave that area. We never found out what those footprints were, nor what Daniels saw among the trees. Even today, just to remember, I feel a shiver, as if there was still something watching us from the darkness of the forest. The body in Rio. It was 1969, and I was in the middle of another mission in Vietnam. I wasn't a rookie, but wartime starts to mess with anyone's head. We were in a remote area, near a river that extended through the forest. The mission was to patrol the area, check for signs of enemy activity, and make sure our base was safe. The tension was always in the air, but on that particular day something seemed different. We were all tired, but decided to move on. The weather was stuffy, the smell of wet earth and rotten leaves invading the air, but the feeling of being observed has never been so strong. We were near the river when we saw something floating in the water. At first, we thought it was some kind of log, but as we get closer, we can see that it is a body. Immediately, our first reaction was alert. Even knowing that anybody found in enemy territory could be a trap, we decided to take the risk. When we pulled the body to the shore, what we found made me cold blood. The man was dressed in an American uniform, but his features were different. Something was wrong. He had his eyes closed, but the skin was very pale and his expression did not look human, almost as if it had been shaped, deformed in some way. I looked at the others, but nobody seemed to have the courage to come closer. It was strange, there were no visible wounds, nothing to explain the man's death, but there was something about the way he was standing there, floating quietly, that seemed wrong, as if he had not been dragged by the current or left there by some enemy. It was as if he had been placed there on purpose. The others tried not to think too much about it, but the feeling that something was very out of place only increased. The image of the body was disturbing, but what really bothered me was the fact that it seemed out of place, as if it were not part of the reality we were living there. We decided to call the commander to assess the situation. When he arrived and looked at the body, his expression changed. He seemed as perplexed as we were, but with his experience, he did not want to show how much he was confused. We gathered the others and tried to lift the body to investigate further, but something bizarre happened. When we pulled the body further to the shore, it was heavier than it should be, as if it were stuck at the bottom of the river. When we finally managed to lift the body to examine it, we couldn't believe what we saw. The body was gone. Only deep mud marks and a rusty old helmet remained. We stood there, paralyzed, looking at the muddy ground. The body had disappeared, and with it, all the explanation that we were looking for. The rusty helmet was there, but there was nothing else. No blood trail, no clothing, nothing to suggest that the body was removed by anyone. I tried to think of a rational explanation, something that could calm us down, but there was no way. The water of the river seemed calm, as if nothing had happened, but the feeling that something else was behind all this did not leave my head. How did the body disappear so quickly? Where did it go? We tried to do what we could. We went back to the camp, and over time the tension started to subside, but the impact of that moment didn't. The thing that haunted me most was the certainty that no one but us would have seen what happened. When we asked the other soldiers who were patrolling nearby, nobody saw or heard anything. The strangest of all is that, even after days, the weight of that experience did not leave our minds. I was warned by one of the war veterans never to come back near that river at nightfall. He said the place had something to do with what happened there, but he did not dare to speak anymore. Since then, whenever I passed near the river, I felt a shiver in my body, as if that thing was still there waiting. Time passed, but the image of that body disappearing from the shore and the weight of the rusty helmet never left me. Whenever the subject arose, the atmosphere became heavy, as if everyone there knew that something very strange had happened, but no one dared to talk about it. Deep down, everyone knew that what we saw had no explanation, and each of us kept it to ourselves. I began to avoid passing near the river at dusk, even if it was a shorter way. The feeling of being observed, that something or someone was still there, never left me. One of the few times I mentioned the incident to one of the other soldiers, he simply looked at me with a distant expression and said, "The river never forgets." He did not explain what he meant, and I never knew if he was speaking metaphorically or if he knew something that he never revealed. We never went back to that area to investigate further. And apparently, no one else in the camp had the courage to make patrols there after that day. The river, with its silent waters, was left behind, but the feeling that something is still hidden in the depths of that place never completely disappeared. To this day, I don't know what that body was or what really happened that afternoon, but somehow I know it will never be something that I can explain. The bird that imitated voices. This story happened in 1971, during one of the operations I participated in Vietnam. At that time, I had been in the forest long enough to get used to the feeling of being watched. The place seemed alive, full of sounds I had never heard anywhere else, and the idea that danger could be in any corner was constant. The mission we were fulfilling was simple: set up a temporary camp and keep an eye on any nearby movement. We were all exhausted and tense, and the damp heat of the forest only made things worse. That particular night, it was almost nightfall, and the forest began to fill with the usual sounds. They were noises that I had learned to ignore over time, until something very different caught our attention. Suddenly, we heard screams coming from a denser part of the forest. It was desperate screams in English, and the strangest thing is that they sounded like someone we knew. Everyone stopped and became tense, trying to identify the voice and understand what was happening. As the screams continued, some of us began to recognize the voice. Looked like Sergeant Thompson, who had disappeared months earlier on a reconnaissance mission. I remember that the blood froze in my veins, because I had accepted that I would never hear that voice again, much less in that situation. The tone was pure despair, and he screamed for help, as if he was hurt or stuck somewhere. But at the same time, there was something strange. The intonation was mechanical, almost as if the voice were a recording being played in loop, repeating the same words. Even with the fear growing, a group decided to approach, trying to follow the sound to understand what was happening. We arm and move slowly, with the adrenaline to 1,000, ready for anything. When we finally got close enough, we realized that the screams came from a tall, leafy tree. It was then that we saw a bird, black and large, perched on a branch. He looked directly at us as he kept repeating what seemed to be the sergeant's last distress calls. The most frightening thing was not only the fact that the bird was repeating those words, but how he did it with a frightening clarity. It was as if he knew exactly what he was imitating, as if he was consciously reproducing the screams. Every time the bird made a sound, the feeling that something was wrong only increased. The bird seemed perfectly aligned with our anguish, and it made no sense. Who has ever heard of a bird imitating so well a human voice, and even more, someone who had disappeared for so long? We were all paralyzed, trying to understand if it was some kind of cruel joke, but the environment was so heavy, so out of place, that nobody dared move. It was as if the whole forest was watching and waiting for something to happen. Then, without anyone moving or talking, the bird continued, imitating more of the sergeant's words, as if the echo of the past was stuck there, repeating an endless tragedy. I tried to convince myself that it was just a bird with a strange ability, but something in me knew that it wasn't normal. After a few minutes, the sound of the screams became increasingly distorted, as if the bird was beginning to lose control over the imitation. The fear spread among the group, and the feeling of being observed became even stronger. One of the soldiers tried to approach the bird, but as he took a step towards it, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that remained was even more unbearable, as if the forest had stopped breathing for a moment. When we looked at the tree, the bird was no longer there. It simply disappeared, leaving no trace. That night was the longest of all. We were silent all the time, feeling the eyes of the forest over us. There were no more screams, no sounds, but something had changed. We could not understand what happened that night, nor what was that bird. I just know that, after that, the feeling that someone or something was always around did not leave us. I tried to talk about it with the others, but everyone was so shaken that no one wanted to argue. The strangest thing about all this is that, to this day, I wonder if any of us really saw what we saw, or was it something our mind created due to the stress and tension of that place?